Chapter 2. Port Delhi. It is known as the gateway to India. It's said in the services that the finest sight in India is this gateway seen from the back end of a troopship. There was much coming and going among the officers responsible for us, the commanding officer frequently conferring with the others, and all bustled about. Eventually we were told to pick up our kit and make our way to a train that was pulling into a siding alongside the warehouse. The train seemed very much like those at home, but when we entered the coaches we gazed round with interest. They resembled the old corridor coaches in Britain, but where those had been divided by partitions, these were separated only by steel tubing, like scaffolding. Each compartment had last bench seats facing each other, but the luggage rack was another bench, while between them the backs of the lower seats could be raised to form a third bunk, so that together each side had 3 bunks to sleep on, 6 to a compartment. There were fans to cool us and electric lights to read by. Luxury! The compartments proved light, with pull-up glass windows with alternative pull-ups of louvres and mosquito gauze. These coaches were, we learned later, specially constructed for troop trains. Once the train started, they proved comfortable and airy, and we settled back and relaxed, especially as miraculously food seemed forthcoming. So, late in the day we disembarked from the ship. We set out on the next stage of our journey. These trains were obviously not noted for speed, but we puffed along at a reasonable pace, considering we seemed to be gaining height into wooded hills that seemed pleasant enough. We all collapsed on our bunks and slept the sleep of the just that night. We awoke to find ourselves still chugging along as we remembered doing all night. This was to be the first of such awakenings, as we spent 3 days on the train. We stopped frequently during those days, sometimes with nothing in sight, and at other times at stations, where we picked up supplies of rations that were awaiting us, spending our few remaining annas on cups of tea from the station charwallahs. Unfortunately, the last day was less productive. We'd run out of food and water, and none was available where we stopped. Eventually, on the 25th of May, Whit Monday, after spending the morning on a single-track line passing through mile after mile of meagre woodland, none of the trees more than 20 feet tall, we emerged at a railhead, situated on barren, sun-baked land, with nothing in sight but an island platform, a few sidings with wagons parked, and an odd hut or two. I think it was called Barkakana Junction. It looked like the end of the world. We had to get out into a temperature of 120 degrees Fahrenheit, quite dehydrated and with no water in prospect. The only shade was that offered by the stationary railway wagons, so we all crawled underneath them in despair. It seemed that as far as the commanding officer knew, this railhead was to lead us to an airfield that we were to occupy, a place called Ramgarh. As usual, Delhi seemed to have imparted this intelligence to no one but him. We were not expected, nor was there food, water, shelter, or anything available to us. We gathered that Ramgarh airfield had in the meantime been occupied by No. 1 India Squadron, fleeing from Burma. Fortunately, there was a small detachment of army people at the railhead. They brewed up tea and a great zinc bath full of salt water, which our systems accepted with relish. They even tried to give us food, but as this consisted of cubes of some form of hard meat boiled in clear water, our stomachs revolted. At last things happened. We were told that nearby was a prisoner of war camp, full of Germans and Italians. One of the camps had been damaged by a typhoon, and the prisoners moved out. It was better than nothing, however, and we could stay there until decisions were taken on our future. There was no transport. We should have to walk the 3 miles to the camp. So, with full packs, carrying rifles, and the temperature as bad as ever, we set out. After about a quarter of a mile, the desert earth was broken by a shady patch of trees. Such was our condition that our engineering officer in charge of our column ordered us to fall out for a 10-minute break. I don't need to draw a veil over the rest of the march and our frequent pauses. It's all a blur. Although I can remember reaching the camp and seeing the army guards there gazing at us in disbelief as they lolled stripped of clothing in the comparative cool of their verandas, enjoying their statutory afternoon siesta. I do recall arriving at the camp, being called to a halt, and the command, "To the right, dismiss," being given. Under the weight of my pack, I couldn't stop my right turn and screwed myself into the ground, from which I had to be lifted by my sergeant. Actually, the abandoned camp wasn't all that bad. The roofs had been partly blown away, but it had been tidied up, and there were charpoys on which we gratefully fell and lost consciousness, and functioning shower bars for us when we came to. We were beyond hunger, I think, but there was an amusing episode. The Indian canteen contractor, sensing good business, drove up in his massive Mercedes and summoned his minions, who rushed in to build an enormous fire, kill chickens, and on a frying pan about 4 feet in diameter, crack and fry dozens of eggs. The squadron stood around in a circle, salivating at the sight. However, there was hardly an Anna between us at that stage, and the cook's extended arms, making an offer of the fried eggs, were met with a despondent shake of the head from all his potential customers. Unbelieving, the caterers packed up and left. Our seniors did their best to keep up our spirits with walks through the jungle, rifle inspections, and the one that did the trick, a modest pay parade. We were obviously in the RAF again. There was a village nearby, and some of us went to look. My diary says, "Never again. Stink, dust, dirt, and disease." May not be true, but that was my first sight of an Indian village. At last, on the 3rd of June, some 10 days later, we packed our kit and embarked on another train. This time we were in civilian coaches, just 4 to a compartment, and very comfortable indeed. The speed of the journey was much more impressive. We travelled northwest along the plain of the Ganges, through Lucknow, New Delhi, and then north into the Punjab. There was an eventful moment when a member of my crowd met his sister at one of the stations. Solon. On the 6th of June, a number of us were detached from the main group, whose destination was Ambala, and proceeded to change at Kalka Junction onto a narrow-gauge railway that was to take us up to Solon, a 5,000-foot-high hill station. Quite a journey. At one hill, the tiny train had to go back and forth on a track that zigzagged up the hill, backing up one line, changing the points and going forward again, gaining height with each manoeuvre. It didn't seem safe, and I don't think it was. We were in the last coach, and it derailed on one of the reverses as there was a rock on the track. Fortunately, it was pulled back onto the track again when the engine went forward. Solon really was a hill station. Our billet was on the side of the hill, and I caused to regret this as I developed terrible tummy trouble and had to attend the sick bay 3 times a day for treatment. It was up the hill about 200 feet above the hut. The loo was about 200 feet below the hut. I certainly earned my keep as a hill climber, but was totally exhausted. The camp had been an army station for many years, and it was highly organised. The first morning we woke to find a nappy-waller, a local barber, lifting our mosquito net in the total darkness at about 5 a.m. and by the light of a small hurricane lamp lathering our face prior to shaving us with a fearsome open razor. Some slept through the whole operation. The chap in the opposite bed had spent the voyage cultivating a moustache. Admittedly, it was only semi-visible, silken down, but he was immensely proud of it, and distraught to find it had been whipped off in the dark by our friend the nappy-waller. We also had a munchie, a teacher, and I attended a number of his classes to learn a little Urdu, which was to prove very useful, as well as being an enjoyable experience. This was an entertaining spell and a welcome holiday. There was plenty to do, an interesting bazaar to go shopping in, a sports day where I won the 400-yard heat, and I seemed to have spent a lot of time on the rifle range. I took a lot of photographs, and Bill and I spent much time together eating out in the naffy or in the cafes. I took advantage of the break to seek dental help for a wisdom tooth that had been giving me a lot of pain. It was decided to extract it under general anaesthetic, and I was taken to the general hospital. I don't know how experienced they were, but I was put to sleep, eventually, by having ether poured over a gauze mask on my face. I was asked to count, and I can remember getting to 120, and the Indian doctor expressing great surprise. I heard him asking if I was a heavy drinker, which I was certainly not. Opportunity would have been a fine thing. Everything seemed so peaceful in Seoul, and no blackout, of course. We ambled around the bazaars quite at ease, and I acquired a knobbly walking stick, which was not strictly according to dress of the day, but no one cared. We were still wearing the tropical helmets we were issued with in England, those policeman-like things one sees mounted regiments wearing. They were intolerably hot and looked rather ridiculous. I noticed from my photographs that at this point we had them exchanged for proper pith helmets, much lighter and cooler. The mountains around us were quite rugged, but all bore some vegetation, including quite a few trees and also giant cactus about 15 feet high. There was obviously considerable vegetation even to the top of the hills that must have been 7,000 to 8,000 feet high, as we were regaled by a spectacle of a forest fire sweeping the tops of the mountains opposite us. However, all good things come to an end, and on the 5th of July we jumped on the narrow gauge train again to start our journey to join the rest of the squadron at Ambala. Ambala wasn't far away, and it only took from 1 o'clock to 11 o'clock p.m. to get there. It was a peacetime station, with great brick-built barracks set far apart and separated by baked earth, with an occasional tree offering homes to dozens of grey squirrels, tree rats they were called there. I wasn't too keen on the place, as we were warned to take care to avoid the crates, small poisonous snakes that crawled in through the sluices and delighted in curling up in our damp towels. I didn't see the aerodrome at all, as we were promptly given orders to pack again. Rizalpur. We'd only spent 2 whole days at Ambala. It was just a holding camp for 99 Squadron, but could only provide for a small part of our number. The rest had to be farmed out to any stations that had room. In our case, a detachment of about 15 of us with Sergeant Jeff Moore, entrained in the late afternoon, comfortably installed in first-class compartments, no food, but we were able to get tea, cakes and biscuits, which kept us going. We travelled northwest, and we reached Rizalpur in the early morning of the 9th of July. This was my first experience of a far-flung outpost of the British Empire. Rizalpur was a peacetime cantonment, very flat and desert-like, at the foot of high hills, but with wide streets on which were British-style buildings, a magnificent church, the YMCA, the post office, the pony track, and so on. One travelled around in tongas, small horse-drawn traps. The camp itself was equipped with a fine outdoor swimming pool, a tennis court with uniformed children acting as ball boys, a library and a canteen with a garden outside adorned with fairy lights. Just a few of the features of this amazing place. Talk about a holiday camp. Just to complete the orientation, I must tell a story of a time when I thought I'd take advantage of this idyllic scene and take a stroll onto the deserted road leading towards the valley leading to the hills referred to above. I'd not gone far when I was stopped by a number of young Punjabis from an adjacent village, where our bearers and servants lived. "You not go up there, Sahib," they told me. "Bad man, he shoot you." Believe it or not, it was only then that I realized I was heading into the Khyber Pass. I was off to Kabul. Needless to say, I took their advice, after a long and enjoyable chat in pidgin English. We had a fine new bungalow dormitory to ourselves. The walls were beautifully smooth plaster. It was only after a terrific thunderstorm in which the rain poured through the thatch near the door that I appreciated that the plaster wasn't plaster at all, but baked mud. A large portion of our wall flowed out onto the veranda. The sun came out again, it was very hot here, and repairs were effected in a flash. We used to spend our working hours, siesta in the afternoon, and back to work for a couple of hours as it cooled, in the hangar or out on the forecourt with the aircraft. 6 months since I'd seen one. There was only the odd plane here. I worked on a Lysander, a strange old aircraft, and a Mohawk, of which I remember little. We had some fun recovering a Hurricane that had crash-landed on the far side of the field. It was being flown by a young pilot from the No. 1 Indian Squadron. A water buffalo crossed the runway as he was landing, and he either didn't know or had forgotten that if you raise the flaps on an overshoot, you lose half your lift. This is what he did. He glided gracefully to the ground on his belly. It didn't do the air screw or the coolant radiator much good, but the rest of the kite was remarkably intact. We lifted it onto a flat top, using sheer legs, there being no crane available. A picturesque spectacle I recorded on film and later painted in watercolours. We seemed to work quite hard in Rizalpur. This was my inauguration into Merlin engines, and I'd been warned of the horrors of dropping a sparking plug into the V of the engine block, and I did it. It is almost impossible to get it back without stripping down much of the engine. I still think of it with a sense of panic. This was an interesting period in my early days in India, very pleasant in many ways, but it had little to do with the war, even though we had an official visit from the then Duke of Gloucester. I wonder why. For my part, I wanted to see the war over and was a little impatient at not playing a part in achieving this. My diary at this time, and even more so later, is filled with mentions of visits to the cinema, almost a daily occurrence. Looking back, I'm filled with admiration at the terrific efficiency of the cinema industry. Whenever I was within anything like civilization, there were cinemas of some kind. They changed their films every night, so that in my 4 years overseas I must have seen about 1,000 films. I sometimes wonder if the war would have been prosecuted more successfully had it been left to the cinema industry. My diary is filled, almost to the exclusion of other news, with entries like, saw Hold That Ghost, Bluebeard's eighth wife, The Bride Came COD, and believe it or not, Dr. Kildare, plus of course hundreds more. The only diary entries that are more frequent are the records of my letters to my dear Betty, almost daily. However, I shall not refer to the cinema attendances again unless there is something of special interest, despite their frequent appearance in my diary. Towards the end of August, rumours began to be heard that we were to return to the squadron. I feel I should interrupt my account here to add some views of my own on the raison d'etre of the squadron and its presence in India. It seems obvious to me, as it will to the reader, that we were never intended to be in India. There are good grounds for reasoning this. 99 Squadron was a medium-heavy night bomber squadron, well adapted for night raids over Berlin, but hardly the weapon to trail Japanese foot patrols through the winding paths of the Burma jungles. Nor was the aircraft itself suited to this purpose. It had air-cooled engines, just asking for trouble in hot climates. It carried heavy bomb loads, and it trundled along at low speeds, whereas the operational scene shouted for nippy light bombers that could drop effective loads on specific targets and be away as fast. To reach the central areas of Burma, where the Japanese had their supply bases and airfields, meant climbing to some 10,000 feet to pass over the high mountains of the Irrawaddy sources, something that was a struggle for the heavy old wimpy. No wonder that India Command was not anxious to welcome this misdirected squadron, nor to utilize its very real abilities proven in the European theatre of war. I feel this comment is needed to let the reader understand the long procrastination before the squadron was eventually put together and used in action. Let us return to Rizalpur. At the end of August, rumours strengthened that the squadron was being reformed and was to go into action from somewhere in Assam. On the 7th of September, at about 9 p.m, this was confirmed as fact. We packed, and leaving behind a heartbroken bearer, our personal servant, went to the station to find a third-class coach filthy with Beetlejuice spittle and cockroaches. It was against King's regulations to require troops to travel thus without full cleansing and disinfecting. With the full support of our sergeant, we refused to obey the command of the RTO army captain to board the train, and demanded the presence of the RAF commanding officer. He duly appeared, put the RTO in his place, and sent us back to camp. The grapevine sent the tale around, and in minutes our old bearer was there, in tears of delight that we'd returned, rushing around, trying to make up all our beds at once. He was a dear fellow. We found ourselves popular heroes for having stuck to our guns, and no more was heard of the RTO's accusations of mutiny. Within a few days, we left Rizalpur in first-class coaches.